I want to welcome everybody to the Opportunity in Crisis, Building Power for a Sustainable and Just Food System in Ohio workshop. And thank you. We're very excited to share more about the work that we've been doing over the past year, and we're eager to also learn more about the work that has been happening in local communities all across Ohio as well. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Brian Estabrook, and I work for Franklin County, which is where Columbus is located, for those who aren't familiar. I'm a food systems planner, and I work focused on our local city-county local food action plan, which is a plan that was adopted by our city and county about 5 years ago. And I'll introduce our presenters in a second here, but let me tee up the session a little bit for all of you. So the group of presenters that you're going to hear from today were convened by OEFFA last year as a rapid response to what we all experienced as these overlapping crises, the global pandemic and the economic downturn that obviously created serious challenges across our country and our world. And as we all know, created challenges for our local, regional, and global food systems. And as the name of our session suggests, we saw an opportunity in this crisis to build a more resilient local and regional food system. Our group came together informally as food and agricultural system colleagues with shared interests and common goals to see that thriving food system develop that benefits the entire value chain, the producers, the eaters, and everyone in between, including the environment and the land itself. We worked to develop solidarity and trust together as we worked on those challenges, recognizing that we could be stronger and more effective when we work together across our organizations and sectors. And one of the biggest lessons that we learned over the past year is that by finding our aligned interests and goals, we can bring together a diversity of perspectives across the food and agricultural system and build power together. And that power can be used to drive collective action that advances our goals to create that food system, that healthy, viable, ecological, just food system that we all want to see. So you're going to hear from 4 folks involved in this group today who are going to give you a sense of what we worked on together, how we built on that, and what it looks like to organize moving forward from here. So let me introduce those 4 folks, and then I'll tee up the conversation and I'll kick it to them. So firstly, Jaime Hadj, the owner of Wayward Seed Farm, the co-founder of Great River Organics, and also board chair of the Ohio Farmers Market Network, who has advocated tirelessly and continues to advocate for farmers markets as essential infrastructure, not only during this crisis, but also during otherwise normal times. We're also going to hear from Tevis Foreman, second, executive director of Produce Perks Midwest, who has worked to establish and expand nutrition incentives statewide. And then we're going to hear from Amy Baskes, a consultant who has worked with dozens of food-related groups on strategic planning and fundraising and facilitation services, including work with the Ohio Food Policy Network and Produce Perks Midwest. And then finally, we're going to hear from Amalie Lipstreu, the policy director at OEFFA, who I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Amalie has remained plugged into state and federal legislative and administrative policymaking and served as a conduit for advocacy around those issues. After we hear from Jaime, Tevis, Amy, and Amalie, we want to open up the conversation with all of you and hopefully have a generative conversation where we can hear how these issues have been affecting your communities and how you have been working to build power and trust and organize to develop this food system and to use this crisis as an opportunity to push forward these issues in your own community. So we want you to be thinking about, how has trust developed in your community? How have new connections been forged over the last year? What kinds of challenges do you see that can be addressed by building a diverse collaborative group of people who share common interests across the food system? So I encourage you to be thinking about those questions, and we'll hopefully be having a generative discussion about those, both by unmuting yourself and offering a question or a perspective with us, and by offering that in the chat if that's where you feel more comfortable. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to first Jaime, and then Tevis, and then Amy, and then Amalie. So Jaime, take it away.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. So thank you all for being here today. As Brian said, I'm here today representing Ohio Farmers Market Network. For those of you who don't know, the network is a nonprofit organization that seeks to represent farmers markets, farmers, food producers, market managers, for not just networking resources, but a unified voice in public policy. We very much believe that collaboration is kind of everything with the farmers market. It's the collaboration between the market itself and its vendors, the market and the community and the vendors. And so this really is a wonderful opportunity for us to collaborate with organizations who do similar things with other groups of people. The Ohio Farmers Market Network immediately, when COVID started, we started receiving all kinds of calls, and whether they be immediate, oh my gosh, I have an indoor market, what do I do, to I've accepted all of these applications and my market opens in 2 months. So we were dealing with an immediate crisis, but also a long-term crisis because we had no information how long this would last. And so we started fielding questions from all over the state, markets large and small, municipalities, cities, you name it. Everybody was looking for information on farmers markets and what are they going to do. We believe very firmly that farmers markets not only provide the access to food, but they are the economic driver for a lot of small food producers and very, very necessary. And so we were quite pleased when the state recognized farmers markets as essential. And so with that came, of course, the responsibility of being an essential marketplace and hosting responsible, safe places for people to shop and get their food. We worked together with this group on a number of things, but most notably for the Ohio Farmers Market Network was a letter and a list of ways in which markets could operate and function in a safe way to meet the essential status. And so we started there, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and people may have questions. But we started with monthly COVID calls for farmers market managers and vendors, and just hearing what were their concerns. And you know, farmers markets struggle a little bit, and this put us to the test because we've been largely recognized as events. And so for some, we had to really make the case that we're not an event. We are a marketplace, and this is where people access and get their food. And so it was a huge challenge for some of our markets. And some of you may be familiar with some of those challenges in your own community, in your own markets. Finding the variation across municipalities, across the state, and how active their health board was or not. How was their market manager full-time? Are they volunteer? All of these things play into the challenges facing a farmer's market. So we certainly appreciate this group and all of the work that we've done. And yeah, again, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I want to go ahead and turn it back to Brian.
Thank you, Jaime. And I'm going to just go directly to Tevis next.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jaime. I'd like to also thank OEFFA for the invitation to participate in this panel, and also the convening that was done early last March in 2020. And then thank you all for being a part of this session today. It's exciting to see all of these faces and hopefully to have some really generative dialogue here moving forward. My name is Tevis Foreman, and I serve as the Executive Director of Produce Perks Midwest. We are an Ohio nonprofit that's leading nutrition incentive programming across the state. We work closely with the Ohio Nutrition Incentive Network, which is a multi-sector coalition of statewide partners and programmatic practitioners, really working within their communities and across Ohio to advance nutrition incentive programming. And in short, nutrition incentive programming, Produce Perks, our flagship program, provides a dollar for dollar match on the SNAP and PEBT dollar. So the work of Produce Perks and the Ohio Nutrition Incentive Programming is really to empower low-income consumers to make healthy food purchases. We do that with intentionality around strengthening localized food systems, so really targeting our program and our consumers that we're serving into farmers markets and other direct-to-consumer producers. Again, to empower that consumer to make healthy food purchases, but also to strengthen localized food systems and really work to build that out in partnership with farmers markets, with our small scale retailers, other programmatic partners across the state. In response to COVID-19 in early 2020, we immediately began matching dollar for dollar across the board without a cap. The program typically provides, and it does now, a $25 cap per day for consumer. So in response to COVID-19, we lifted that cap, and we also began matching PEBT dollars as we saw those coming down and appropriated from Congress. So we made certain pivots programmatically to be able to expand purchasing power for our consumers, and also targeted dollars to help address infrastructure needs at our local farmers markets, as well as other programmatic practitioners. And in that context, from PPE supplies to dollars for point of sale systems and online SNAP purchasing opportunities. So really focusing dollars to develop infrastructure to help meet needs that were presented because of COVID. And at that same time, again, empowering consumers to make these purchases and to support our local producers and small scale retailers and markets. I'll stop there. I look forward to discussing the work a bit more, but I'll go ahead and pass it on to Amy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I see old friends and some new faces, and I'm excited to get past this intro presentation part and into the conversation. As Brian said in his intro, my name is Amy Baskes. I'm based in Columbus. And I currently work as a consultant with many food and farm organizations. And that's the culmination of a 25-year career in sustainable food and farming organizations. I've been an executive director and a development director of national organizations in this space. But for the last 10 years, I've been consulting with statewide and local groups, various project-based jobs that help organizations improve their fundraising and operate more strategically, including many of the people on this panel, right? And I say all that not to sort of show my credentials to you, but I suspect many of you are also networked and involved in your community. You volunteer in your local food policy council. Through your paid work, you sit on boards of organizations, right? You work collectively. And I think the panel that we're trying to demonstrate today is how that fabric of relationships and networks helped us last March to really address the issues that were bubbling up. And so as March settled in last year, some of the first things I did were ask myself, you know, what's important to me? What issues matter to me? Who's important to me? Who do I know? And how can I help? And I asked that question of myself on a local level. I was cooking food for people. I thought we all were going to get COVID in March of last year, and we were going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. And so I wanted to make sure the people that mattered most to me had food in their freezer. I was buying it from local farmers and cooking it for friends. And that's like a circle of influence that I knew I could control. But what I was more interested in also, additionally, beyond that, when it looked like we all weren't getting COVID in March last year and going to be quarantined for 2 weeks, was what is that bigger circle need, and how can I address that? And through my work relationships with Produce Perks and the Ohio Food Policy Network, I was invited to this group that OEFFA was convening every couple of weeks, where we, again, we're asking, who do we know? What are the issues and how can we address them? And we were really just crowdsourcing those concerns, hearing the stories at the bottom up of growers whose contracts were, ended. They were selling to schools or they were selling to restaurants that were closed. Farmers markets, as Jamie said, who were wringing their hands saying, I've got all these contracts with growers and we don't know if we can open in our community because our health department thinks that, we're going to be unsafe. How do we do this appropriately? And we just, in these weekly conversations, which were really just kind of egoless, collective brainstorming, we took notes, we made assignments, we did research. I think Jamie single-handedly read everything on the internet that related to farmers markets eligibility to be open, gathering information from other states. And she says that, farmers markets were deemed essential, but our group worked to ensure that farmers markets were deemed essential based on the research that Jamie was doing and others were doing, and based on that collective work that we were able to do together to get a meeting with the Ohio Department of Agriculture, right, which was new territory for us, and make the case for farmers markets to be essential and have them accept the kind of draft document of the way that farmers markets could operate safely that Jamie had researched and we had put together, right? Similarly, Tevis talks about the work in SNAP. SNAP enrollment was through the roof, right? Unemployment records were being shattered, and those kind of procedural changes that allowed more people to access more SNAP, the PEBT, the pandemic EBT monies that became available, to make sure that those were allowable at the farmers market, and that the regulation around produce perks and those incentive dollars could be expanded so that we really could meet the hunger crisis that was mounting and that we were facing. So again, just getting back to that, who do you know, what's important to you, and how can I help? Those were questions that we asked of our group that, varied in size from 5 people to 20 people. We invited other organizations as we realized we needed help from kind of a research standpoint, what was happening at Ohio State. We invited organizations with boots on the ground. And once kind of the farmers markets were open and the SNAP dollars had been extended, and those systems were, kind of, I don't know, at a less of a crisis point. Well, not to say we're out of it, but then we started to say, what are the low-hanging fruit asks that we would want to continue to use this collective power, right? It wasn't centered in one organization. It was across many organizations. Where are the places that we all can agree that if we had audience again with a state agency or a federal representative, elected official or agency, that we would want to ring a bell for, right? And call attention to. And that resulted in the drafting of a report midsummer, which is the title of our session today, Opportunity in the Time of Crisis. And the organizations that put the logos across the bottom weren't all the people involved in feeding it, but that was through OEFFA, the Farmers Market Network, Produce Perks, and the Ohio Food Policy Network. And we thought we were going to write a one-pager, a white paper, and it ended up being not just a longer document, but it has photos that we crowdsourced. It has anecdotes and stories from growers and eaters on the ground that we had relationships with. And we ended up hosting a policy briefing for state policymakers and a media briefing to say that this report had been released. And these were collectively the 8 policy areas that we were calling for. And they weren't just organizational policy asks, they were these collective asks. The link to the report is in socio in the documents that that sort of were included in registering for this session. And I think Brian is going to put a link to that report in the chat. And then finally, I'll say that, so that was summer, right? We kind of had this shared list of policy items that we were informally and formally working to advance. And then along those lines, the Ohio Food Policy Network, which is an informal network of networks, right? Food policy councils at the local level and a listserv that really anybody can post information to who's interested in policy, food policy at the state level, post and receive information from. Developed as a kind of out of our strategic framework, which was we called our roadmap. We have 4 areas that we're interested in working: local farms, healthy food access, food infrastructure, and institutional purchasing. And we developed kind of policy statements around those 4 areas, populated with specific policies that we wanted to see advanced through our summit, which happens in the fall at Ohio State. Folks gave us ideas, and that list also has been sort of collectively crowdsourced over the course of this year in the context of you know, this policy cafe that we were convening every couple of weeks. So I'm going to stop there and just sort of give that context of how we work together, both intentionally and strategically, at how we were forced to strengthen relationships based on that intersectionality, and with that understanding of how interconnected, both interconnected and vulnerable our food system is, and how we can make that change together. And I'll turn it over to Amalie as our last panelist.
Thank you so much, Amy, Jamie, and Tevis, for laying that really great groundwork of what led to almost a year of collaboration so far. And I'll say, you know, it's just kind of interesting that this is not like any formal network. And we've had, you know, we had questions several times throughout the year, like, we're meeting every week. Do we want to still keep doing this? Do we need to still keep doing this? But the answer was always yes. And we kept finding more and more work that we could do collectively together and ways we could be more effective. So I have to say, it's really been a pleasure working with Amy, Jamie, Tevis, you know, Brian and others over the past year, because as Amy said, you know, it's not been organizational ego. It's been, what do we need to do to be of service and to address this crisis? And they say that crisis can bring out the good and bad. It certainly brought out the good for all of our organizations in Ohio. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my colleague, Milo Petrozello, because Milo called me early on, and you know, when he heard about the potential that markets might not be deemed essential infrastructure, and Milo and I got on the phone, and it's like, okay, who do we need to bring together to start talking about this? And so we have been, you know, brainstorming for a year about, you know, our agenda setting and what we might want to think about and what we might want to do together. So, you know, I have a few prepared remarks, but based on things that have been said already, I want to just mention a few things that jumped out as really being critical. One is pivots. You know, this whole situation brought about numerous pivots. Farmers had to pivot, markets had to pivot. You know, we all had to pivot our lives to respond to this crazy situation we were all placed in. And doing those pivots, we realized that there were needs out there for people to be able to pivot, whether it was dollars or resources. And just as one example, something that came out of the first CARES package, or coronavirus assistance package, was a program called CFAP, which was supposed to provide assistance to farmers. Well, that first iteration that came out was really geared to provide assistance for large-scale commodity growers, and it didn't really serve all farmers. So, you know, working with some of our, you know, with our group internally, with mobilizing our networks and communicating with our other state national networks, you know, we shared feedback. And then when the second CFAP round came out, it was much more user-friendly for farmers and accessible. And we heard really good feedback. So that's just one example. And I will share that report that Tevis linked in the chat, the Opportunity and Crisis Report, there are still outstanding recommendations in that report that we want to see move forward, because we know that the coronavirus was a wake-up call. And all of us know it revealed the vulnerability of our food system and the need to develop more resilience in that system. So if you were on the call with Sherrod Brown, Senior Policy Advisor, this morning, you heard him speak to the opportunities that exist. And those are very real opportunities that I think it's incumbent upon all of us to seize that window of opportunity and bring changes that will make our food system more resilient. Just a few more things then, because I want to keep it short. I love these like short presentations, so you're not listening to talking heads and we can have a conversation. But, you know, we tend to think of success being driven by resources like knowing people in Washington, D.C. who are walking the halls of Congress, or people who are in the State House with intelligence on what's moving and what the possibilities are. And that's there. And that's important, but more important really, and what drives the process is having the people behind the people on the ground. You know what the needs are, you know what your challenges are and what opportunities we have ahead. So in my role as policy director, I interact with numerous coalitions and networks, and they're effective because they include three important elements: organized people, those with similar goals and ideas working together to learn, network, develop a plan, and act to achieve a shared goal. They have organized money, membership, support from individuals, foundations, and more. And they have organized ideas, shared values, and a narrative that describes what they're working for and toward, and articulate the kind of changes that we want to see in the world. So each group, coalition, or network brings their own groups of people and resources and ideas to bear on the needs and opportunities. So in the cases like the COVID crisis, it's important to know who the people and businesses are who are affected by the pandemic in states and districts across the country. As Amy mentioned, what are the problems? Who's affected and how? What are the broader implications for our communities? And then we worked collaboratively to tell the stories of affected people, farmers and businesses, as well as people who needed to access local food to feed themselves and their families. We did over the past year, and what we need to continue doing is to empower people to tell their stories, whether it's through reports, opinion pieces in the newspaper, or making calls to staffers that work for members of Congress. We need to be able to articulate a narrative of care for our farmers, for the people who are trying to access food for themselves and their families, protecting jobs for people in the community, and building greater food systems resilience. So in this case, OEFFA brought some staff resources to bear. But through our work together, each having our own people, resources, and values, we were all able to multiply our effectiveness. So we talked about, you know, this issue of the vulnerabilities of our food system and opportunities. And I think, you know, this is a great opportunity for all of us to have a conversation about how we can work together, how we can bring resources to bear to make our food system more resilient in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back to Brian.
Thank you so much, Amalie, and thank you to Jaime and Amy and Tevis as well. And we want to open up the conversation with all of you now. And I'll preface that by providing a little summation of what we've heard and offer a couple of questions for all of you to consider. And I hope that despite the virtual setting, that you all feel free to raise your hands, offer things in the chat, and hopefully unmute yourself and share some of what you're seeing. So, we know that the food and agriculture is a system, and that system involves all the points along the supply chain and all the physical infrastructure and relationships and networks and institutions and policies that impact that system and enable that system. This past year for us, for this group that came together, has reinforced the importance of approaching the food and agriculture system as a system by looking at ways to build trust and solidarity across the different parts of that system, and to identify common interests and goals that we can push forward with together, as Amalie just said, to multiply our effectiveness. Our Opportunity in Crisis report, and which is linked in the chat, and the subsequent engagement that we had with state government officials and the media, and our policy advocacy around a variety of issues, including farmers markets and nutrition incentives, that's one example of this becoming activated. But there are more. The Ohio Food Policy Network, which is also linked in the chat, and all of you are invited to join if you're not a part of already, is also an example of a venue, of a place that could hold that kind of work moving forward statewide as we stay connected. We want to learn from you. Here are some questions that I'm going to offer, and I can put these in the chat as well, that I would love to hear, we would love to hear responses to. How has trust and solidarity developed in your community over the past year in response to these crises? What new or unexpected connections or collaborations have developed? And which ones would you like to see develop that haven't yet? What kinds of challenges and opportunities do you see in your community that could benefit from this kind of greater collaboration? And what are the stories that need to be told? And finally, what ideas do you have for building effective coalitions in your community? And to again, go with that line that Amalie had, how can we continue to multiply our effectiveness together? So I'm going to open it up, and we'll have that awkward moment where we'll see if anybody is willing to talk about stuff. And our panelists are just going to kind of be here and available to comment and listen. And we invite you to share, and we'll be monitoring the chat as well with the help from our friends from OEFFA. Feel free to raise your hand or indicate that you want to speak in the chat. Okay, I see James raising his hand, so please feel free to speak.
Yeah, well, I'm in Youngstown. We have built a regional lake to river food co-op that's tied together a lot of these pieces. And one of the things we've realized is while it's growing, the pieces all work together better. But when it starts to contract and we lose a lot of our market and a lot of our customers, and it takes some really heavy lifting to even just stay open. And we have a cooperative cafe, which got shut down right away. And that was probably 20% of the revenue of the overall co-op sales. So, it makes me worry about hooking things together to cooperate. And then when you have to scale back down, how do you keep in place what's still there? And I think, what we've been able to do is use the cafe space for bulk box food assembly with the healthy foods programs and a variety of other things. And we've been able to kind of piece together something. Tevis has been a big help in keeping some of that going. And we have a strong anchor hospital that does the healthy food prescription program. So it's just a caveat that if you get too many things hooked together and they stop working, how do you keep some of that in place or not?
Thank you so much for that comment. And I'm gonna toss that to our panelists. Maybe I'll toss it to Amy, actually, because Amy has worked with a lot of national groups and different kinds of projects. And I'm curious, anybody can answer that, but as we think about groups coming together, in maybe more rich times when there isn't a crisis? What happens when maybe conditions change and maybe the conditions for cooperation change? What do we lose when that starts to sort of retract? And how do we hold on to some of those things that we developed by working together? Any thoughts from that?
Well, I'll try to respond, Brian. But what I'm reminded of in Jim's comment is the crisis part of the crisis, right, really laid bare the stressor points in our food system. And we ultimately are, as much as I tried to cook my way out of the pandemic last March and make sure my family and friends had 2 weeks of food in their freezers, that, here we are a year later, that only got me and us so far. And our food system is a system, right? And that interdependence and that collective, whether it's in a co-op or it's, in your city or your state, is bigger than one actor, whether that actor is a person or a business. And so, finding what those stressor points were, and really lasering in on that as the shared issue you want to address. It very quickly bubbled up in the context of our group last spring that we all needed to keep farmers markets open, or that was a lifeline for growers that couldn't be cut off after schools and hospitals contracts were shut down. And we very quickly wanted to make sure that the programs and agencies and groups that were all addressing farmers market life were all rowing our oars in the same direction to make sure that the farmers market stayed open. And Amalie used the word pivot, right? And it sounds like Jim in Youngstown, the pivot to that box program, right? Like revenue's down 20%, the supply's down 20%, stuff is kind of whittling down from your bigger, more robust days. But there were kind of programs that it sounds like you latched onto to turn a pivot, to make lemonade in those moments. And I can imagine there are obviously examples in my personal life, my church life, my family life, my community life of kind of what did the pandemic reveal and lay bare that you determined were essential, right? And how can we take these lessons from pandemic times into kind of how we operate going forward? It's a little bit of a song and dance answer, but hopefully you got some nuggets out of it.
Well, and if I could jump in just quickly there, James, I just want to say that's a really critical example of how communication is really beneficial. Like, for us to know, like when that happened, that's the situation that you found yourself in and that your organization was in. And when new aid packages were being designed and we saw, they created a program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Well, that wasn't at all accessible to like agriculture and food businesses. But then they had the Paycheck Protection Program and other programs that were available to provide support to folks that had seen those kinds of interruptions. So I would say that's a really good example of how critical it is that we're all communicating so we understand what are the issues on the ground and how can we advocate for you to have the resources that you need.
Absolutely. I see Jodine's hand up. And before we go to Jodine, I was going to offer a question that I see in the chat. And maybe I'll toss this at Amalie, or maybe Jaime could comment. It's from Ross, who says, as a market manager, one of the biggest challenges I see to our food supply is the limited capacity of farmers to grow a sufficient supply of produce to meet demand. Is there anything that can be done on a policy level to address food production and supply? And maybe I'll add a little bit to that question and say, what kinds of networks or coalitions can we think about putting together to address that kind of challenge. Amalie, you're muted.
Thanks, Brian. I think that's a really good question. Certainly the way our farm policy is structured, it's really structured around a handful of major commodity crops. And the kind of supports for those crops and things like the current structure of our crop insurance program, which is heavily subsidized by taxpayers, I'll say, discourages farmers from experimenting or diversifying what they grow. Now we know we'll never be able to grow 100% of the fruit and vegetable needs for the state of Ohio. And in fact, Dr. Jill Clark and I believe Shoshana Inwood and a few others did a study probably 8 or 10 years ago now about how much fruit and vegetable need could be met by farmers in the state of Ohio. We could go back and dig up that data at some point if you're interested. But to get at, Brian's addendum to that question, what we need to do is we need to understand how this really kind of, this convoluted, abstract farm bill language that people don't quite understand really affects farmers on the ground and their decisions to either take risks, to diversify, or not to do so, and how we support them in doing so. And again, I'll say, as we're getting ready for the 2023 Farm Bill, now is the time for us to be having those conversations.
Thank you. Amalie, you mentioned that 2021 is the time to begin having this conversation. And I would just add to that, the Ohio Food Policy Network is a space where that conversation can continue. And I'm sure that if you're part of the OEFFA listserv as well, as I imagine all of us are, that's another space to continue that conversation. I saw Jodine's hand go up, so I'm going to go to Jodine, and then I'm going to go to Harv after that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have a long history here. In fact, we're one of the biggest areas of the state to do tailgate markets, going back to actually the early 70s and the beginning of OEFFA. So we have a strength here in our history. I want to name 3 or 4 pivots. I like that word pivot a lot. I think that was really nails it for what the different ways we've been trying to adapt. Some of you may know in Cincinnati of the Hyde Park Farmers Market. That's a long-standing market, a very powerful one. And they did several pivots. One was to pivot to an indoor location. And there's been some history of that already, to do that in winter months. So that was utilized with spacing. There was also online ordering, so that the order was placed in advance and people could come and pick up their order. When the weather was good enough, we moved back outside for a while with a lot of distancing outside in the Hyde Park Plaza. So a combination of online ordering, spacing, and flexibility to move in and out to different locations helped that to survive. I don't know where it is exactly right now, but those are a couple of examples. Excuse me. Another example is moving out to food deserts. So mobile units, trucks. I can't think of its harvest home. I can't remember the name of it right now, but there was a location in a very kind of inner city neighborhood in Walnut Hills. A plaza. It was an old abandoned Kroger lot, basically, where these trucks would come and people could come and pick up food there. But then they increased that to go on out into neighborhoods that were really terrible food deserts. So that, bringing produce out to people. So that's a second example. The third one is there was strong utilization of online ordering, and then the networking of people, because there is a strong history here that's going word of mouth to word of mouth. So the collaboration again amongst these different sectors, neighbors, neighborhoods, growers, and urban and rural, helped a lot of farmers. And then the fourth thing I want to say is the media. Just this last week, I believe it was, I saw in our Cincinnati Enquirer, wonderful article about local growers and some of the the hoop growers, I mean, the people who were growing already and giving them some kind of pre-press, I think, for this next year, you know, is a very powerful thing too. So these are 4 examples that might be, you know, resonating with others or utilized by others as well.
Thank you so much, Jodine. And I'm gonna open it up to Harv first, and then we'll go to the panel here for any general responses to any of this. Harv, do you want to offer any thoughts? Looks like you're muted.
I think I'm unmuted, right? You can hear me?
Yep, you're good now.
My comments are on processed food and what's allowed at the market. It seems to me that in Ohio, we have a list, and if it's not on the list, it's not allowed. And I'm told by inspectors that the way to get something on the list is through your politician, not necessarily science. So I have a concern with that, because it's fine if you have a processed kitchen, but processed kitchens are not plentiful in Ohio, and they're expensive, but it could be affordable if you could rent a space at a kitchen, and that's available in some communities. So my concern is what's allowed in terms of the market inspectors, and it varies with counties and with inspector within a county. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. And I'm seeing a theme of farmers markets here. So I'm gonna throw it over to Jaime, and maybe Jaime, thinking about obviously some of what Jodine said, thinking about how are markets pivoting, how are markets working together, how are markets kind of building their coalition and moving forward in this crisis, and then also to Harv's point, how do we start to make some changes on a policy level to how those markets function?
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you all. I mean, the comments and the questions that you're posing are absolutely what we're looking for, and absolutely the conversations we should be having. And the first thing that I want to say is that, you know, we're talking about collaboration, we're talking about pivoting and making changes, and you know, pre-COVID. A lot of the times, especially farmers markets, you know, we're used to, we can do things on our own, right? We all take pride in being able to jump and act quickly and make decisions. And COVID really highlighted the need to work together. And I think what we see, or what I can say I saw, was the best, the quickest, most nimble changes and nimble markets were ones that had built really great relationships. And so it shouldn't be cast aside that how important these relationships are, because in a time of crisis, when you really need your health inspector to be generous and nice and work with you and not against you, having a pre-existing relationship went a long way. I can tell you that from experience with some of the markets we worked with, versus ones who had never met their market manager before and suddenly we were calling upon them. So I think this is an opportunity for all of us to reevaluate and say, yes, we've worked together, but do we really have a strong relationship? Is our dialogue and our communication truly open? So that was what I was taking away a theme of the first 3 sort of questions and comments there. More to Harv's point, and Harv, I'm happy to connect with you after the fact as well, but I want to, at least for anybody else who may be in this situation, farmers markets in the land of regulation is very confusing. What I will say is Ohio is actually incredibly lenient compared to other states. So we're always careful at what we wish for. So the list that you're referencing is the cottage food law. There are about 21 items that are very specifically defined as being allowed at a farmer's market, a registered farmer's market. So you want to make sure your market is registered with the Ohio Department of Ag. But those things are allowed to be made in the home under cottage food law. What's not allowed is everything else. If it's not those 21 things, right, it's not allowed under cottage food. But that doesn't mean it's not allowed at a market. It is allowed at a market. You just have to have the right the right license or the right inspection. And some of those are as little as $10, and you can still make them in your home. So there, I'm happy, again, I'm happy to connect with you offline and help. I'm happy to help anyone. But it can be very confusing. And if you ever have an issue, please contact us, because we have a great relationship with the Department of Ag to get to the root of some of those issues. And sometimes it's that the inspector just doesn't understand. They just don't know enough, and they just need to be led in the right direction. And so if we can help make that happen, we're happy to. You know, generally our market managers know more than our food inspectors, which isn't a bad thing. That's a really great thing that our market managers are so informed, but it can make sometimes navigating that relationship a little challenging.
And
thank you.
If I may,
yeah,
Brian,
go for it.
I think, you know, Amalie in her opening remarks mentioned that idea of organized ideas, right? And organized people. We've all talked about the strength of relationships, but in produce perks and in the incentive world, one of the organized ideas that we've had for a while is to see an expansion of SNAP and our incentive programs through e-commerce, right? Which we could spend a whole panel about how Byzantine both enrolling for and offering SNAP is filed under no good deed goes unpunished. But I think the idea of that expansion through e-commerce, and that relates to farmers markets as well, was a burgeoning idea in this moment, that because of the magnitude of the crisis, we all were able to get audience with folks to say, help us do this now, help us make this more efficient, right? And so I think having our list of organized ideas, having your short list of organized ideas that the pandemic has laid bare, or just your operations have laid bare, I think it helps all of us to have those at the ready, because in a crisis, we may have different people listening and different mechanisms in place to address them. I don't know if Tevis wants to speak more about that, specifically as it relates to SNAP and SNAP at markets and that
I certainly can, but I'll be very brief given time. And I know Ross has a question, and there's a few others in the chats. But to what James spoke of earlier too at the Lake to River Co-op, and I'll give a kudos to the Youngstown Valley region. There's a lot of great work happening out of there and very committed stakeholders. But some of the pivots that were made were some of the intentionalities around how to more effectively and directly contract with local producers to reach low-income consumers, and how best to really utilize these dollars from SNAP, PBET, and the nutrition incentives that are supporting the purchasing. And I think we found, e-commerce included, some very creative and opportunistic opportunities here to move forward in bridging that gap between consumer and producer. But again, I don't want to spend too much time in that, given that we have very limited time here. So Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you for those really great answers. I'm going to try to fit in 3 more things in the 5 minutes we have left. So the first thing is I'm going to ask Amalie for a 15 or 20-second response, if you can manage it, Amalie, to Luann's question in the chat, which is, are there any opportunities with Ohio redistricting to improve the representation of Ohio farms and communities, and also communities that need better food access? Are there any opportunities for that? Is that feels maybe unrealistic, but I'm just curious for your thoughts on any opportunities there.
Boy, that's a really excellent question. I'm afraid, to be honest with you, I can't answer that in 15 or 20 seconds, but I will say it's something that we should look at. The whole process of redistricting, of the way our districts are drawn and apportioned is designed in a way that tends to disenfranchise key populations. I think it's incumbent upon us.
Looks like we're losing your audio a little bit there, Amalie.
Sorry about that. I think it's incumbent upon us to better understand that redistricting process that's going to take place and look for those opportunities.
Thank you. And I encourage anybody, again, the Ohio Food Policy Network and the OEFFA listserv are great places to continue these conversations. Ross, I'm going to let you ask your question. If you could make it as quick as possible, it would be much appreciated. Looks like you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I don't know that I had a verbal question to ask. I wrote in the chat that I was wondering what could be done on a policy level to basically help encourage more small farmers to be able to increase food production, because I see that as one of the biggest challenges as somebody who's involved as a market manager.
And Amalie, that seems like a question that you addressed a little bit earlier. Is there anything you would build on with your previous comments?
I would just say that I'd really love to have an ongoing conversation with a whole group of you on a regular basis, because these are really critical issues that we can address, and we have a unique window of opportunity. I don't do this work in a partisan manner, but the fact that Congress and the president is all under one party control does present a unique window of opportunity ahead. So I think we need to have this conversation. I would encourage all of you to stay in touch with us, whether it's through OEFFA, the Ohio Food Policy Network, Produce Perks Midwest. We want to hear your voice, because you know what? We're not going to be successful doing this in isolation. We need you to be doing this work. And we need, that's one of the things I think Jamie, Amy, Tevis, and Brian would agree on. Our work together was so much more effective than each of us working alone in a silo. So we want to work with you collaboratively in the years ahead to address some of these issues. So please stay in touch.
And in the last minute that we have, I'm going to ask for like a 5-word response from each of our panelists on what do you see as the next pivot or the next opportunity for collaboration. And so I'm going to go Jamie, Tevis, Amy, and then Amalie. Give me your 5 to 10 word response to that.
Oh, wow. Where do I start? It's markets working together with one another in a region and working with their municipalities, their counties. That's a big, big starting point.
Tevis.
Big question. Further empowerment of consumers. I'll leave it at that.
Amy.
I'm heartened that policymakers and Department of Ag types who previously didn't, this isn't 5 words, obviously, but previously didn't acknowledge local food options are saying that our food system, given the vulnerabilities at the consolidated federal level, were laid bare in the pandemic, that they're actually talking about local food systems as a solution going forward. And I want to help them in that pivot and welcome them on our journey.
Absolutely. And finally, Amalie.
My 5 words: food system resilience and climate change.
Okay, I love that. And my last comment for everybody is organized people, organized ideas, organized money. That creates power that we can use to advocate and make change. So I encourage all of you to continue the conversation through the OEFFA listserv, with the Ohio Food Policy Network, and with all of our panelists here. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the conference. Thank you, OEFFA.
Thank you, OEFFA.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, OEFFA. Take care, everyone.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was great.
Thank you, Joy and
yeah, I mean, you did everything.
Appreciate your help.
You did everything, Brian. So, so thank you.
I like to be organized on the back end, so Thank you very much. Please let me know if you need anything, and will they be emailing out the recordings at a later time?
I'm not sure if they'll be emailing them, Lauren.
I think it's available on the Socio app until March 31st. Milo will be going through the recordings and getting those uploaded as soon as he can.
Awesome.
And I'm just gonna
All right.
put the survey for this workshop in the chat.
Oh, I did.
Oh,
It
okay.
just, it kind of got
Yeah, I saw it.
swept up
Okay.
by all the thank yous.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I'll just remind people to do it if they get a chance.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Tevis and Jamie. Good to see you.
Yeah, great stuff, everybody. Thank you.
Good to see you guys too. I'm glad to be back. I need to work on the rust.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you later.
Well, you get some rest, Jamie.
I'm gonna try.
All right, we'll see. Joy,
Bye.
Lauren, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks.
I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting.
All right. Bye.
Bye.